In a small, tight-knit town, there was a woman who had become a familiar face to many. She wasn't rich or famous, and she didn't come from a family of great influence. She had a simple life, working at a local store that everyone went to for their daily needs. She was the kind of person who always wore a warm smile, and though she didn't have much, she always gave freely of her time and heart. People liked her because of her kindness and down-to-earth nature. There was nothing about her that screamed extraordinary, and that's how she liked it. She wasn't interested in drawing attention to herself. She was content with the small joys in life. Her name wasn't something many people knew or remembered. To the locals, she was simply the woman at the store, or the one who always greets with a smile. Her life was quiet and comfortable, and that's the way she preferred it. She spent most of her days behind the counter, helping customers with their groceries, chatting with regulars, and enjoying the peace that came with her simple routine. At the end of the day, she'd return to her small but cozy home, where she'd cook dinner, enjoy the evening with her cat, and then retire to bed. But there was something about her that the people around her didn't see. She wasn't just a simple woman, quietly going about her life. She had skills, knowledge, and experiences that most people would never expect. Yet because she was so humble and unassuming, no one ever bothered to look deeper. They simply saw the surface, a woman who wasn't loud, didn't boast, and lived a quiet life. One day, there was an event happening in the town center, a gathering that brought people together to celebrate the local harvest. There were food stands, music, and games for the children. It was a lively event that the whole town looked forward to each year. People came from all over to enjoy the festivities, and this year it seemed even more crowded than usual. The woman, as always, volunteered to help set things up. She wasn't the type to want the spotlight, but she was happy to pitch in where needed. As she worked, she noticed a group of young men standing around the food stand, laughing and chatting loudly. They were from the local college and often came to the town's events, but they usually kept to themselves. They were confident, outspoken, and very much aware of their social status. They liked to show off, and their conversations often revolved around how impressive their academic achievements were, how they were destined for greatness, and how they were above the simple pleasures of small-town life. The woman didn't mind them. She had seen many like them in her years. They were young, full of themselves, and assumed that they had it all figured out. What caught her attention, however, was when one of the young men, a tall one with sharp features, turned to his friends with a mischievous grin. "Hey, do you think that woman knows how to play chess?" he asked, pointing to her. The group laughed. They were obviously making fun of her. They had seen her around town for years, always smiling and greeting everyone, but they had never seen her do anything that might suggest she was interested in anything other than simple pleasures. They assumed she knew nothing about strategy games, especially something as complex as chess. To them, chess was a game for intellectuals, a game that required a sharp mind and years of practice. The tall young man, feeling a bit too confident in his abilities, turned back to the group. "I bet she doesn't even know how to move the pieces," he said with a laugh. His friend snickered. "She probably couldn't tell a knight from a bishop," one of them joked. The woman heard the conversation, and for a moment she considered ignoring it. After all, they weren't saying anything directly to her. But something inside her stirred. She had never been the type to back down from a challenge, especially when it involved being underestimated. She had heard people talk down to her whole life, assuming she didn't know much just because she lived a quiet, humble existence. With a calm, composed expression, she walked over to the group. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, letting them see her. She could tell they were surprised that she had heard their conversation, but she wasn't angry. She simply saw it as an opportunity. "I heard you're talking about chess," she said, her voice steady and friendly. The group fell silent for a moment, looking at her with surprised expressions. They hadn't expected her to speak up, let alone engage in a conversation about chess. The tall young man raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by her sudden presence. "Yeah, we were just talking about it," he said, trying to recover from his earlier remark. "You know, the game with the board and the pieces," she nodded. "I know what chess is. In fact, I've played a few games in my time." The young man grinned, his ego not quite dented yet. "Really? Well, if you're so good at it, how about we play a game? You know, just for fun. I bet you won't even know where to start." His friends chuckled again, clearly enjoying the situation. They thought it would be funny to watch this simple woman try and fail at something they considered a game of intellect. But she didn't flinch. She simply smiled back, her eyes calm and steady. "I'd be happy to," she said. And just like that, the challenge was set. The young man and his friends were sure it would be an easy victory. They assumed that this woman, who had never shown any interest in games like chess, would make an easy target. After all, they thought, how could someone so unremarkable be good at such a complex game? As they set up the chessboard on a nearby table, the woman sat down across from the young man. Her calm demeanor only added to his growing confidence. The group gathered around, ready for the spectacle of what they thought would be a quick and easy game. But as the game began, something unusual happened. The woman's moves were measured and thoughtful. She didn't rush, didn't make wild, random moves like they had expected. Instead, she took her time, studying the board carefully as if each move mattered deeply. The young man, confident in his skills, made his first move, a flashy one, meant to show off his knowledge. He moved a pawn, then another, trying to establish control. His friends looked on, eager to see her reaction, but she didn't react the way they expected. She moved a pawn as well, simple and unassuming, but it was clear she was making a strategy. The young man didn't notice at first, too focused on his own plan. He made another move, trying to pressure her, but she countered with ease, shifting her pieces as though she had been playing chess for years. The group began to grow silent. What had started as a light-hearted challenge was quickly becoming something more. They had underestimated her, thinking that someone who lived such a simple life wouldn't have the skill or the intelligence to play chess at a high level. But as the game progressed, they were beginning to realize that they might have made a huge mistake. The woman's moves were deliberate, precise. She didn't show off, but it was clear that she knew exactly what she was doing. And as the young man made his next move, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He had always been the smartest in the room, but now he was starting to question whether he had bitten off more than he could chew. The game continued, and the atmosphere around the chessboard started to shift. What had begun as a light-hearted challenge was now turning into something more serious. The group of young men who had initially laughed at the thought of this quiet, humble woman playing chess were starting to pay closer attention. Each move she made was calm, measured, and purposeful, and the young man across from her began to realize something he hadn't expected. He was not winning this game as easily as he thought. At first, it had seemed like a joke. The woman, with her soft smile and simple manner, was nothing like the competitive, sharp-minded players he was used to. He had expected her to fumble, make mistakes, maybe even not know the rules very well. But instead, each move she made was thoughtful, precise, and deliberate. She wasn't rushing like so many beginners did. She was playing the game like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The young man's confidence, which had been so firm at the beginning of the match, began to crack. He moved his pieces faster now, trying to regain control of the game, but the more he rushed, the more mistakes he seemed to make. His friends, who had been laughing and chatting earlier, now watched in silence. They could see the change in him, the hesitation in his movements, the increasing doubt in his eyes. He wasn't as sure of himself anymore. One of the young men who had been quietly observing the game leaned in toward another, his voice low. "What's going on? He's playing so much faster now. It's like he's panicking." The other young man nodded, equally confused. "I don't know. At first he was just toying with her. But now it's like she's got him cornered." Indeed, the woman's strategy was becoming clearer to everyone watching. She was building up her pieces slowly but steadily, creating a web of control over the board. Her movements, though simple, were like a quiet storm. She was setting traps, planning her attack. The young man, on the other hand, was trying to play aggressively, desperate to turn the game back in his favor. But in his haste, he was exposing weaknesses, gaps in his defense that the woman was quick to exploit. With each passing move, the young man found himself retreating. He moved his pieces back, trying to protect his king, but it was becoming harder to hold on to the advantage he once thought he had. The woman had outmaneuvered him in ways he hadn't expected. She wasn't just playing defensively. She was slowly dismantling his strategy piece by piece. The young man's friends were starting to get uncomfortable. They had been expecting this to be a quick, amusing game, a way to prove to this simple woman that chess was not a game for someone like her. But now they could see that she was in control, and it made them uneasy. There was a moment when one of them whispered to the group, "I didn't think she'd actually be good at this. This is unexpected." The woman, however, remained calm. She wasn't gloating, wasn't showing any signs of arrogance or pride. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. She simply played. Her moves were quiet, almost like whispers, but they carried the weight of experience. It wasn't about showing off or trying to impress the men. It was just about playing the game for what it was, an intellectual challenge, a battle of wits. As the game wore on, the young man's face grew more and more tense. His earlier confidence had been replaced by frustration. His pieces, once spread across the board in an organized fashion, were now scattered, vulnerable. He tried to think of a new plan, but nothing seemed to work. Every time he tried to make a move, the woman had already anticipated it. She had him on the defensive, and he was starting to feel cornered. The group of friends remained silent now, their eyes glued to the game. They could see that this was no longer a simple match. The woman wasn't just participating, she was winning. And the more the young man struggled, the more the truth became clear. He had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. The woman's next move came quietly, almost imperceptibly. She moved a bishop across the board, and for the first time in the game, the young man's expression faltered. He looked at the board, his mind racing. His king was now in a position that was difficult to protect. She had set him up perfectly. The trap was closing, and he could feel it, but he didn't know how to escape. He took a deep breath and made his move. But it was too late. The woman's next piece took his queen, and with that, the game shifted decisively in her favor. He stared at the board in disbelief. How had this happened? How had someone so quiet, so unassuming, managed to outsmart him at every turn? His friends looked at each other nervously. They had all expected him to win, and now, as the woman calmly moved her pieces forward, they realized that this wasn't going to end the way they had imagined. The young man was no longer just playing to win. He was now fighting to avoid being humiliated. He glanced around at his friends, who all seemed as shocked as he was. "This isn't happening," he muttered under his breath, but there was no escaping the truth. The woman had him where she wanted him, and it was only a matter of time before he was checkmated. The game continued, but now there was a different energy in the air. What had started as a fun, light-hearted challenge had become a battle of wills. The woman wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing to prove a point, not to the young man, not to his friends, but to herself. She had been underestimated, mocked even, and now she was showing them all what she was truly capable of. For the young man, the realization came too late. He had spent the whole game thinking he could win with ease, thinking that this was just some kind of joke. But now, as he tried desperately to defend his king, he understood that he had been wrong. This woman was not the simple, naive person he had assumed her to be. She was intelligent, strategic, and capable, more than capable, in fact. And he was about to learn the hard way that underestimating someone was a dangerous mistake. The group of young men, once so confident in their superiority, had fallen silent. They were no longer laughing or making jokes. Instead, they watched as the woman moved her pieces with precision, slowly but surely taking control of the game. It was becoming clear that there was no way out for the young man. He had been bested, and all he could do now was wait for the final blow. The woman's hand moved once again, positioning her pieces in a way that left the young man with no escape. He was trapped. His king was surrounded, and there was nothing he could do to stop the inevitable. It was only a matter of moments before she would declare victory. And in that moment, the young man realized that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the loudest or the most arrogant, but the one who is quiet, patient, and steady. And as the woman's final move fell into place, declaring checkmate, the young man felt a mixture of shock, awe, and embarrassment. He had lost, not just a game of chess, but his own pride. And as the woman looked up at him with a calm, almost serene expression, he knew that this was a lesson he would never forget. The moment the woman declared checkmate, the group of young men fell into stunned silence. No one spoke. The game was over, and the young man across from her sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the chessboard, trying to process what had just happened. He couldn't believe it. His mind was racing, replaying the moves, trying to figure out where he had gone wrong, but the truth was undeniable. He had lost, and the woman had outsmarted him at every turn. The other young men exchanged uneasy glances. They had all been so sure of the outcome. They had thought the woman, with her gentle smile and quiet demeanor, would be no match for their friend's quick thinking and strategy. But now, as they watched him sit there in disbelief, they realized how wrong they had been. The woman sat calmly, her hands folded in front of her, not showing any sign of triumph or arrogance. She wasn't gloating or celebrating her victory. She had simply played the game, and in the end, she had done what she set out to do. Her victory wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about proving something to herself. She had been underestimated, mocked even, and now she had shown the world that appearances could be deceiving. The young man slowly pushed his chair back and stood up, still unable to fully grasp what had just occurred. His friends, who had been so confident just moments before, now looked unsure of what to say. The silence in the air was thick with discomfort. Finally, one of the young men cleared his throat and spoke up. "That was impressive," he said, his voice hesitant, almost unsure. "We didn't think you knew that much about chess." The woman smiled, a soft, gentle smile that carried no trace of sarcasm or superiority. "I've played before," she said simply. "I enjoy the challenge of it." Her words were so calm and unassuming it made the young man feel even more embarrassed. He had tried so hard to impress them, to show off his supposed expertise, and yet here he was, standing in front of her, having lost to someone he had dismissed as unworthy of the challenge. The woman didn't rub it in. She didn't need to. Her quiet strength had already made its point. She had never been interested in showing off her abilities. She had always been content with who she was, and that was something the young man had failed to recognize until now. He felt a wave of humility wash over him. His earlier arrogance, his belief that he was above others, seemed so childish in hindsight. He had assumed that because she didn't carry herself the way he expected, because she didn't fit into the mold of someone who would be interested in such a game, that she wouldn't be a worthy opponent. But in the end, it was his own pride that had blinded him. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, he had learned a valuable lesson about humility. I didn't expect that," he said, his voice a little quieter now. "You really know how to play." The woman nodded, her eyes kind. "It's not about how well you play or how quickly you can win. It's about being patient and thinking ahead. Every move you make, you have to consider what comes next." The young man was beginning to understand. It wasn't just about the game, it was about life. It was about taking the time to think things through, to plan, to be patient. He had rushed through the game, trying to make flashy moves and force his way to victory. But in doing so, he had missed the bigger picture. The woman, on the other hand, had taken her time. She had thought ahead, moving each piece with purpose, never rushing, never letting her emotions cloud her judgment. One by one, the young men began to speak, each of them acknowledging their mistake. "I can't believe we thought you didn't know anything about chess," one of them said. "You're incredible." The woman simply smiled again, her expression warm. "I'm just someone who enjoys a good challenge," she replied. The young man who had lost the game stood there for a moment, lost in thought. He realized that this was more than just a game of chess. This was a moment that would change the way he saw things. It had been a lesson in humility, in patience, and in never underestimating others. "Thank you," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "I learned a lot today. I thought I was above this, above everything. But you've shown me that there's always more to learn." The woman gave a small nod. "We're all always learning," she said simply. "No one knows everything, and that's okay. What matters is that we're open to learning and growing." The young man couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude toward her. She hadn't just taught him how to play chess. She had taught him something far more valuable, a lesson in life. It was a lesson that would stick with him for a long time, one that would change the way he viewed others and the way he approached challenges in the future. As the group began to disperse, still talking about the game and the lesson they had just witnessed, the woman quietly packed up the chess pieces. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it, didn't want to bask in the attention. For her, the satisfaction wasn't in winning or being praised. It was in knowing that she had faced the challenge, played the game, and come out on top. But as she packed the pieces into the box, she couldn't help but notice the shift in the way the young men looked at her. They no longer saw her as the quiet woman behind the counter, someone to be underestimated or overlooked. They saw her for who she truly was, a person with intelligence, patience, and the ability to think critically. And that, more than anything else, was what mattered. The next day, when she returned to work, things felt different. People greeted her with a newfound respect, and the atmosphere in the store seemed lighter. Word had spread about the game, and people were talking. Some were still in disbelief, amazed that the quiet woman they had all known for years had beaten one of the brightest minds in town at a game of strategy. But what surprised her most was the way the young man and his friends had changed. They didn't treat her like they used to. They were more polite, more considerate. They didn't laugh or make assumptions about her anymore. Instead, they greeted her with a kind smile and a word of thanks for the lesson she had taught them. She had earned their respect, not through boasting or bragging, but through quiet, unwavering strength as she went about her day, helping customers and keeping the store running. She reflected on the game and the lesson she had learned herself. She had never been one to seek recognition or praise. She had always believed that action spoke louder than words, but sometimes it was important to stand up for oneself and show the world what you were capable of. She had done that, and in doing so she had earned more than just a win in a game of chess. She had earned the respect of others, and that was something she had never expected but was grateful for all the same. And as the day went on, she couldn't help but smile to herself. She had been underestimated, yes, but in the end, it had only made her victory sweeter. She had proven that sometimes the quietest people had the loudest impact, and that was a lesson worth remembering. The days after the game passed quietly, but the shift in how people viewed the woman didn't go unnoticed. The young man who had been so sure of his victory now found himself thinking about the game more than he would have liked to admit. Every time he walked past the store where the woman worked, he would catch himself glancing inside, half expecting to see her behind the counter, smiling her quiet, unassuming smile. He had learned more than he'd ever expected from a simple game of chess, and it had humbled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in a long while, he started questioning his own assumptions. Before the game, he had been confident that intelligence and success were things that came from the loudest voices, the ones who made sure everyone knew how much they knew. But now he realized how wrong he had been. It wasn't about being the loudest or the most confident. It was about having the patience to listen, the quiet strength to observe, and the humility to learn. And the woman, despite having no interest in proving anything to anyone, had shown him all of this without even trying. He couldn't stop thinking about how calm she had been, how she hadn't let him or anyone else rush her into making mistakes. In the days that followed, his friends, too, reflected on the lesson they had learned from the game. They were no longer dismissing the woman as just another quiet, unremarkable person. They saw her for what she truly was, someone with strength, patience, and intelligence. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky and the air had that warm, golden hue of early evening, the young man found himself standing outside the store. He had meant to come by just to grab a quick snack, but now he hesitated. He wanted to talk to her, to thank her properly for the lesson she had given him. It wasn't just about chess anymore. It was about life, about how we all make judgments, sometimes based on nothing more than appearances, and how those judgments can be so easily wrong. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and walked inside. The familiar scent of freshly baked bread and the soft hum of the store's music greeted him. As usual, the woman was behind the counter, quietly assisting a customer, her warm smile evident as she offered her usual friendly greeting. She looked up when the young man walked in, her expression not one of surprise, but just a quiet acknowledgement of his presence. "Good evening," she said with a nod. The young man nodded back, hesitating for just a second. Then he cleared his throat. "Hi, I've been meaning to talk to you." She raised an eyebrow slightly as though she had already expected something like this. "Is everything all right?" she asked kindly. He smiled, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Yeah, everything's fine. I just wanted to thank you. For the game and for the lesson you taught me." She paused, looking at him with a calm but knowing expression. "You don't need to thank me. It was just a game." He shook his head. "No, it wasn't just a game. I've been thinking about it a lot, and it really wasn't. It was more than that. It made me realize how much I've been taking for granted. I've always assumed that I was the smartest person in the room, that the loudest voice was always the one that mattered, but you showed me that it's not about that at all. It's about paying attention, being patient, and not underestimating people. You didn't just beat me at chess. You beat my arrogance." The woman looked at him for a long moment, and he could see that she wasn't judging him. There was no look of superiority on her face, just understanding. Finally, she spoke again, her voice as gentle as always. "It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we have all the answers," she said. "But we all have something to learn from each other. I'm glad that you're open to seeing things differently." The young man felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had been nervous, unsure of how she would react to his apology, but now he felt a sense of peace. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't the only one who had learned something from the game. She had taught him, yes, but she had also been teaching herself all along. Her quiet strength, her patience, it was part of who she was, not something she had to prove to anyone. He smiled again, this time more genuinely. "I think I've got a lot to learn, but I'm willing to listen now. I don't think I'll ever see things the same way again." The woman gave a small smile in return, her eyes soft. "That's the start of a good journey." For a moment they stood there, silently acknowledging the exchange. The young man had come to thank her, but in doing so he had realized something much bigger. It wasn't just about chess or winning or losing. It was about life and the people who crossed our paths, the ones who quietly teach us the lessons we need, even when we don't realize it at first. He had been so caught up in proving himself to others, in competing for attention and recognition, that he had forgotten the power of silence, of simply being present. The woman, in her simplicity, had reminded him that it was the quiet people who often had the loudest impact. Before he left, he turned to her one more time. "You know, I'm going to try something different. I'm going to listen more, pay attention to what's really important." The woman nodded, her smile still gentle but now touched with a quiet pride. "That's a good decision. It's not always about what you know. Sometimes it's about what you choose to learn." He nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude that went beyond words. "I won't forget this. Thank you again." With that, he turned and walked out of the store, leaving behind the small town with its familiar faces and daily routines. But he knew that something had changed. The woman had given him more than just a lesson in chess. She had given him a lesson in humility, patience, and respect. As he walked down the street, the world felt a little different. The noise, the rush of everyday life, everything seemed a bit quieter now. He found himself noticing the small things more. The way people spoke to each other, the little gestures of kindness, the moments when someone quietly stepped up to help, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. And from that moment on, he made an effort to listen more, to be more present, and to appreciate the quiet moments. He realized that sometimes the most important lessons in life weren't shouted from the rooftops or broadcasted for everyone to see. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came from the simplest, quietest people, just like the woman who had changed his perspective. One chess move at a time. Weeks passed since the game, and the young man had continued to reflect on everything he had learned. The lesson had seeped deep into his daily life, affecting the way he approached situations, the way he viewed people, and how he handled challenges. What had once seemed like a light-hearted, almost trivial encounter had turned into one of the most important experiences of his life. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman, her calm demeanor, and how effortlessly she had shown him what it meant to be truly strong. It was the kind of strength that didn't rely on making a scene or boasting about accomplishments. It was the kind of strength that came from within, from a quiet confidence that needed no validation from anyone else. And that, he realized, was the kind of strength he had been lacking all along. The young man began to make small changes in his life. He took time to listen more to those around him, to really hear what they were saying instead of rushing to make his point. He stopped trying to dominate conversations, to be the loudest voice in the room, and started valuing the quieter moments. The world seemed a little less noisy now, a little more manageable. He found peace in stepping back, in giving others the space to speak and share their thoughts. One day, as he was walking through town, he happened to pass by the store again. He had been by many times before, but today was different. He had been thinking a lot about the woman and her lessons, and for some reason, he felt like he needed to see her again. It wasn't that he wanted to prove something to her. It wasn't about that at all. It was about acknowledging the impact she had had on his life, about thanking her for showing him a side of himself that he hadn't known existed. He took a deep breath and walked into the store. As always, the scent of fresh bread and the low murmur of quiet conversations greeted him. The woman was behind the counter, as she always was, smiling and talking to a regular customer. She looked up as he entered, and without a hint of surprise, she nodded in recognition. "Hello again," she said warmly. The young man smiled back. "Hi. I just wanted to stop by and say thank you. Again." She looked at him curiously, not needing an explanation but waiting for him to elaborate. "I've been thinking a lot about what you taught me, and I realized that it wasn't just about chess. You showed me something much more important, how to really pay attention to the world around me and the people in it." She listened quietly, her gaze soft but attentive. "I used to be so focused on proving myself, on being the smartest or the most impressive person in the room. But now I see that it's not about that at all. It's about being patient, listening more, and understanding that everyone has something valuable to offer, even if they don't shout it from the rooftops." The woman smiled, her eyes kind but not surprised. "I'm glad to hear that." He hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "I wanted to ask you something, if you don't mind. How did you learn to be so calm, so confident in your own quiet way? I've spent so much of my life trying to impress people, and I've always felt like I had to be the loudest or the most noticed. But you don't seem to need any of that." The woman considered his question for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "I think it's because I've never needed to seek approval from others. I've always been content with who I am, and I've learned over time that it's not about what others think of me. It's about how I feel about myself. I've learned that the loudest voices don't always have the most to say. Sometimes the most important words come from the quietest places." The young man nodded slowly, taking in her words. They made sense, more sense than he had ever realized before. He had spent so much of his life seeking external validation, thinking that he had to prove his worth to others. But now he understood that true confidence came from within. It came from accepting who you were, without the need for constant praise or attention. "Do you ever get frustrated, though?" he asked. "I mean, when people don't see you for who you really are? When they think they can just walk all over you because you're quiet?" The woman smiled again, but this time there was a little more warmth in her expression. "Of course, sometimes it's frustrating, but I've learned that frustration doesn't get me anywhere. It's better to let things go, to focus on the things that truly matter. If someone doesn't see me for who I am, that's not my problem, it's theirs." Her words struck him deeply. It was so simple yet so powerful. He realized how much energy he had spent over the years trying to get people to notice him, trying to get them to understand him. But the truth was, the only person who truly needed to understand him was himself. Once he accepted who he was, once he found peace with himself, nothing else mattered. He felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. This woman, whom he had once underestimated and dismissed, had become one of the most important influences in his life. She had shown him a different way of living, one that wasn't about competing, about proving yourself to others, or about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being true to yourself, being patient, and understanding that every person had value, regardless of how much they spoke or how much attention they received. "I've been trying to take things slow," he said, a little embarrassed, but also sincere, to listen more, to not rush into things. "And I think it's making a difference. It feels better somehow, like I'm not carrying around so much weight anymore." The woman's smile softened and she nodded. "That's the way to do it. Life doesn't have to be a race. It's okay to take your time, to figure things out at your own pace." He looked at her, really looking at her for the first time. She wasn't just the woman who had beaten him at chess. She was someone who had mastered the art of living with intention, of being present and at peace with who she was. And in doing so, she had given him a gift, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "I hope you know how much of an impact you've had on me," he said quietly. "I don't think I could ever thank you enough for the lessons you've taught me." She looked at him, her eyes kind but not filled with pride or vanity. Just simple, quiet understanding. "I'm glad to have been able to help," she said softly. "But remember, the most important lessons are the ones you teach yourself." With that, he knew it was time to leave. He had come for answers, but what he had found was something more important. A new way of looking at the world. A way of living with grace and humility. He walked out of the store feeling lighter than he had in a long time, knowing that he had been given something priceless. As he stepped into the fresh air, the world seemed different. People passed by, their voices blending into the background, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't in a rush to be anywhere or do anything. He was content just being. The woman had shown him that sometimes the best way to live was with quiet confidence, patience, and a willingness to learn. And for that he would be forever grateful.